I'm really excited about this panel because I'm a bit of a governance nerd. I've tried to hide it, but there's no point. This is a pretty heavy-hitting panel. I'm so excited for the three of you to join us. It's really unfortunate. We had Joe Ball due to join us as well. Joe's the Victorian Commissioner for the LGBTIQA+ communities in Victoria. Unfortunately, he's sick. So it's almost unusual to be on a panel that talks about diversity and it's not a non-diverse panel with just women on it, but here we are. But there is a mixture of experience here, which I'm so excited about. So Jess, I might start by introducing you. You're a Wiradjuri woman from country New South Wales. You're the CEO of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute and co-chair of Outward Bound Australia. I didn't know this about you, Jess. You used to be a teacher. So now I'm feeling a little bit nervous. But thank you so much for being here. You've got an incredible amount of experience in the sector and we're pleased to have you. Catherine, you're at the Governance Institute of Australia. You are the General Manager of Policy and Advocacy, and you have been for a long time, since 2017, is that right?
And they still haven't fixed fundraising.
We'll get to that. Catherine, you have a long history in the sector as well. So you've served as Company Secretary with the Cancer Council in New South Wales, MPP Australia Limited and Youth Off the Streets as well. You're a qualified lawyer and you've worked both in Australia and Hong Kong, so I'm excited to talk to you as well. And Mariam, thank you for being here. You're the Board Diversity Lead at the Australian Institute of Company Directors, a former CEO of the Media Diversity Australia, a Membership Director at the Diversity Council of Australia. You were named the 2023 Asian Australian Leadership Award winner, and your TED Talk on privilege has over 500,000 views. I've watched it, it's fantastic. We might drop a link in the chat to that so others can watch it as well. Thank you all for being here. What an amazing opportunity. The reason we wanted to talk about diversity is because we know that charity boards have a significant responsibility in overseeing governance of charities, and in turn, perhaps the biggest influence on how charities operate and deliver impact to the people that you serve. We know that lots of boards, whether they're in this sector or in the corporate world, lack diversity and really struggle with that. And though we don't have a lot of time to talk about that topic and everything that goes into it, I'd really like to explore it from two perspectives. Firstly, I want to look at what diversity means in this context. I want to talk about why it matters as well. And then secondly, explore some of the barriers and challenges for boards looking to increase or maintain the diversity of their membership. And we might finish with some practical tips as well, because I think that's a great takeaway. So, Mariam, I'm going to start with you. What does diversity mean when we're talking about boards?
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. So the intentional inclusion of a diversity of perspectives, and so there are, numerous diversity dimensions, and those diversity dimensions can also be very intersectional. So it's not a box-ticking exercise, although many unfortunately do tend to take that approach at times. It is about acknowledging that you want to reflect the diversity. I'm used to saying audiences that you serve, having worked at Media Diversity Australia, but ultimately your stakeholders, your representatives. And so it is about reflecting Australia back to itself, ultimately, and in doing so, it is about then looking at all the different diversity of experiences that one brings. So it's not just demographic diversity, it's cognitive diversity, it's the sector experience that you bring to something. And an angle, I think, that is often not looked at is social class as a diversity dimension, and that's particularly critical in this sector. So I think it's really taking putting that perspective and recognising that those diversity of lived experience and perspectives is critical to improving governance, productivity and a host of other benefits that diversity brings on boards.
Fantastic. And Jess, I'm sure you've got things to add there.
Oh, it's just such a great start, and thank you for your moderation as well. It's often you sit at these things and you go, oh, they're going to read my bio, it's going to be really embarrassing. But I think you've done a really good job of getting us all started, and thanks so much for that. that really technical explanation. It's a great start. I would say in the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, and maybe I can sort of start with some of the stats and the framing so that it sort of gives perspective to what I'm talking about. We're of course here with ACNC, the regulator. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, we will know of another regulator of ORIC, the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. And underneath ORIC, of course, if you are an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander focused organisation, you don't need to be registered with ORIC, but many are. And in fact, ORIC's data is more accessible than ASIC, so we'll sort of live in ORIC data for a minute. But there are 3,400 organisations that are ORIC registered. And within those, you have all sorts of different things: community services, organisations focused on land and water management, health services, education and training programs, that sort of thing. So I guess just to sort of give that picture of diversity for emerging and established Indigenous directors within the community controlled sector, but then also the growing responsibility and obligation to take on opportunities outside of the community controlled sector. We live in a world where there are 3,000 RAP organisations in this country, all of which have advisory boards. There are different university programs that will have... So there's growing opportunity for Indigenous, emerging and established directors across the sector. I just wanted to paint that picture to sort of talk about, well, what is diversity within Indigenous organisations, but then the pull on emerging and established Indigenous directors to contribute their diversity in other places.
That's great. Catherine, I want to ask you why it matters.
It's interesting. I have been involved with the not-for-profit and charitable sector for quite a while. One of my other roles is I am president, and I think I'm the first woman, of Glebe Rowing Club Inc. Rowing, most undiverse sport you would ever come across. It's basically the preserve of white, tall, private schoolboys. But did you know globally the fastest growing demographic is women over 50? So women over 50 are taking up rowing like no tomorrow. So we've actually been really thinking about that in that organisation. So diversity matters because it means you're going to do a better job of running your organisation. You're going to better represent the community that you live in. You're going to have better engagement with your members because you're more reflective of them. You're going to have a broader range of thinking. I mean, I have a particular background and I will think about things in a particular way. It's good for me to have different perspectives reflected back to me. And that's just at an individual level, but I've also seen it operate. Certainly, particularly, I have gone back to be involved with Cancer Council New South Wales, and I'm on their Governance, Nomination and Remuneration Committee. They have a very large corpus and they have a very large operation. They actually need to start thinking about diversity and skills. It was quite interesting listening to the panel after lunch about how more and more charities and not-for-purpose organisations are looking more closely at skills. You know, to keep going and to remain sustainable and to maintain public trust, you need to have access to a really broad range of skills these days. It's not just well-intentioned. And I've actually had a couple of diversity-related conversations during the breaks. I was talking to someone today and she said, look, most of our board are older volunteers, you know, because they've got time. But the people we benefit are younger, typically, from other countries, and they come in and out of the city. So, you know, how do I get access to those sorts of people to be part of our board? So it really matters.
Thanks very much. And Jess, I want to ask you about cultural and educational load in a moment, but that challenge of having the privilege of volunteering, we've talked a little bit about that. I know that you're busting to speak about it. I'd love to hear your views.
I mean, we had our pre-chat and I said, oh, how direct do I want to be? Anyway, making sure that I'm respectful, but it is, of course, and look, probably, I think somebody said it just before, if you're in this room, you're already engaged on these topics. You're already engaged in what good looks like in this sector. So it's sort of a bit of that analogy of preaching to the choir, but there are two things that came up for us recently at an AICD panel. We were speaking about remuneration in the not-for-profit sector for not-for-profit directors, and we talked about how there's such a typical career in Australia of traditional fields, you know, law and finance, and then you come out of that into a professional NED career, and that's really common, and we see that a lot. And but to what extent does access and privilege dictate who leads our social sector in this country, and how dangerous is that, and what can we do to not just grow the pipeline but create the infrastructure to sustain the pipeline so that we can create situations where that educational load, that if you have, and I have to learn your terminology as well because that was so well said before, but if you have a particular element of your identity that is diverse, you will go everywhere you go. If there's something that's different or special about you, everywhere you go, you will find yourself having to share a bit about that, and that's a load, you know? It can be anything about you. I made the joke in our pre-chat that sometimes you can, in the spaces I walk in, you can find yourself accidentally in a couple of meetings throughout that day where you go, oh, I've got to do a bit of cultural awareness training here before I can get anywhere. And I imagine that there are people who have other parts of their identity that are different and special that that can get really exhausting. So it's not just about how we grow the pipeline and build the infrastructure to sustain that pipeline of effective directors, but how on earth do we look after them and create safe spaces where people aren't going to just go mad and not be able to contribute effectively?
It's really good to talk about that, Mariam. I want to ask you about some tactics that you can use to, I guess, maintain diversity on a board. So Jess has touched on the fact that if you've got an element that is diverse about you, for want of a better term, you might spend a lot of your day or a lot of your engagement on a board that you've joined representing that element of yourself. But we want directors to be engaged in everything that the board does, and we want them to feel included and safe to speak up on the finances of the organisation and to actually fulfil their role. What have you seen that's really effective on onboarding directors in that way?
Lots to say on that, and thank you for everything that you said. I completely agree. I think I'd describe it as it's not just bringing in a diverse voice, so to speak. It's about then creating the cultural and psychological safety, the conditions that can enable that voice to be not only for them to raise their voice, but for the board and the stakeholders to listen to that voice with a clear intent of wanting to listen and not just to tick a box. And so that requires scaffolding support, that requires, I think, cultural awareness training amongst boards and stakeholders so that those individuals sharing, and the cultural load is enormous. You know, when they're speaking to their lived experience, which I've been called upon multiple times to do as a refugee from Afghanistan, for example. And the added, and this is where the intersectional lens comes into it, you don't, and I also have a legal background as well, so, you know, if you put me on a board and there's instances where that's happened, I'm not just going to give you that perspective, I'm going to give you my legal brain, I'm going to give you, you know, all the different elements that form my identity. So, you know, and the thing about diversity is that we do tend to tokenise and compartmentalise and say, right, we're going to bring Mariam, because, you know, her photo is going to look great on our website or on that post, you know, and so that's where the tokenism comes into it. So really it's also about creating that cultural safety, ensuring there's cultural awareness and training amongst boards, and then going, how can we get the best out of this person in recognition of the cultural load? And in some instances that might mean having an advisory board, that might mean ensuring that that director is paid for their time, and also that there is the scaffolding, as I said, to ensure that voice is nurtured and listened to and not tokenised.
That's awesome. We're going to get back to some other practical steps, but I've jumped forward a bit, so I'm going to go back. Jess and Catherine, I'd love to know if you've seen examples of where some of those players that Mariam has spoken to have been really effective, or you've sat on boards where there's been an introduction of diversity where maybe there hadn't been previously, and that's really fueled the impact of that organisation?
I can't remember where I read it, but diversity doesn't mean just one person of the sort of diversity you're looking for. Oh, it came up in the context of, diversity doesn't just mean women, but the whole discussion I remember some years ago was, you need more than one of a particular kind of diversity to make a difference.
Critical mass.
Critical mass, yeah. So, that's really important. So I think you actually need to have, and I often find a lot of our members are company secretaries, and they often, will start having these conversations with a chair. And if you can get your chair on side, that's usually going to be very effective, or at least will be the start of starting the diversity conversation. But I've certainly seen it, having come back to Cancer Council New South Wales after a gap, they have moved much more to a sort of, they've always had particular requirements, certainly they've got a big focus on rural, so they've always looked for people from, not from the capital city, but also with a research background, given that cancer research is what they do. But they're also moving much more to a skills-based, and I can actually see, just how that is paying dividends for them.
I'll maybe share a story. There's an organisation called Aboriginal Investment NT. If you don't know it, write it down in your margin, Google it. Really interesting organisation, established under amendments to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the NT. That board is made up of 12 people, 8 representatives, 2 each from the 4 land councils in the NT, so Tiwis and Diliaqua, Northern Land Council, Central Land Council, 2 government-appointed directors, and then the board appoints 2 independent directors, which typically means they access then skills in finance and other areas that they might not have found across the board already. That's a really interesting example of diversity, because you've not just got the skill diversity, but you've got the cultural and geographic diversity across the NT as well, being part of that decision making around investments from those particular funds, from mining royalties in the NT. That's a really interesting model and an interesting organisation where diversity is written into the way it is set up. Other examples that I see where it's not necessarily in the legislation but in the policy documents or the governing documents that sit underneath is we see Aboriginal organisations that run community services that say, for example, will work with health services or childcare services. They'll ensure that there's written into their documentation a place on the board for an Aboriginal parent or an Aboriginal doctor, or Indigenous. That's a bit lazy of me there, but meaning to talk of instances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led and governed organisations. So there are some examples there where diversity is written into the governing documentation of the organisation. And I think also, it's a bit more of a personal story. When I first joined a board, I was, as you said before, a recovering teacher, working out what on earth I was trying to do with my life, because I'd gone to university and thought I was all that and then didn't want to be a teacher. And so I was sort of, early days not-for-profit sector trying to work it all out. And I joined a board simply because a boss said, this is important for your career, go do that. And I didn't really have much, to be honest, planning other. But when I first got into that first board position, I went, oh, there's a lawyer, there's an accountant, and all these traditional fields. And I sort of went, okay, well, what's unique? Well, I'm Aboriginal. Okay, well, what can I... and then I realised over time, because it was a really good board, a really effective, well-educated board, and we did a lot of the work on the, what the chair would say, forming, norming, storming, performing, those sort of stages that a board goes through. But we did a lot of that work to get to know one another, and that was key for me, because I then realised I was the young person. I knew about branding and PR and comms, and I was in a leadership team on a not-for-profit. So when the board was trying to conceive of how to convey strategy or changes to the leadership team of that organisation, I had their hat on, and that was beneficial to the board, because the board was all much older than me. So it took me a little while to go, hang on a minute, I don't need to be a lawyer, mind you, I am a governance nerd, and I have done, my financial acumen is hard earned, and I've built it over years, and I don't ever put myself down in that field because I've learnt it, right, in order to run an organisation, in order to be an effective chair. But it took me a little while to realise how my diversity was, and my uniqueness was at contributing to that board. So I thought I'd just share those sort of 2 stories, 2 examples.
And actually, I think Jess has just touched on a really good angle. We're kind of at a generational or inflectional point in the charitable sector. We are seeing, this big transfer of intergenerational wealth. We're seeing baby boomers age and become less capable of doing things. How is the sector going to win the hearts and minds of younger people? Because it's going to... And they do care. I mean, I know I talk to my kids and stuff, but, they care about stuff and they're really passionate about stuff. So it's, how do we bring this coming generation into the sector to give their talents? Because they have talents and skills that we need.
I feel like I'm monopolising the conversation, so maybe because I do have a point that adds to that, but then I'll try and shut up for a little bit. It's really interesting your point about bringing youth into, when I say youth, I don't just mean young people, but emerging directors, because you can be a new and emerging director and not be youth, whatever your definition of youth is, but that new directors, new talent into the pipeline. In the Indigenous context, we are a younger population, and if you also compare the average age of ORIC directors to the average age of AICD members, again, I don't know that those two stats really tell the story, but close enough, there's a difference of about 10 years, right? 50 to 60. So we are joining boards younger, and we are a younger population, so it is absolutely amplified in our communities that we build emerging director programs, pathways, infrastructure. But I also really recognise that back to the point I made at the beginning about the complexity for emerging and established Indigenous directors is we are wanted everywhere, right? We are wanted everywhere. And so what we've got to do is, we talk about, what is the barrier to diversity on boards? And you read, what comes up in all the literature. It comes up and it says, we work from established networks. It's the rowing club, brings his mate, and, we went to King's together. And, that's a fact that we're overcoming in this country. And so... but we don't want to do that just in diverse groups either, because people get to know me and they'll ring and they'll say, do you want to join the board of, and I go, I have no idea about that sector, but let me introduce you to some people and let me give you some ideas on how to have a process about an expression of interest that might be attractive and what networks to put it in so that it's not nepotism within the diverse group, because that's problematic too. We need to grow the pie, grow the whole sector.
Cool. Yeah. No,
yeah.
Jesse's stealing my questions before I get to it, but this is good. This is great. You talked about emerging directors programs. You didn't talk about shadowing opportunities, but I'd like to. Mariam, I'd like to ask you, from the AICD's perspective, you do a great job at providing education to prospective directors, NFP directors, and very established ones as well. What are some of the things that you've seen that work in terms of maybe mentoring programs for new directors, whether they're diverse or not, maybe come through a traditional recruitment process? What works the best in terms of what you've seen?
I think hybrid approach of different initiatives and programs. So I've been with the AICD about 7 months now. One of the signature programs that we've done is the Chairs Mentoring Program, which does actually run at an ASX level, but there are other programs that are broader. And so I think in terms of what works is in the DE&I space, if you look at what are the barriers, right? And it's the closed circuit recruitment, it's the calling your mates, as you said, and it can happen within diversity, right? So it's how do you, if they are the structural barriers, what are some ways to address those structural barriers? So things that you'd all know, sponsorship, mentorship, targeted programs that targets people that may not necessarily be able to afford those programs. And this goes back to the earlier point about the privilege of volunteering your time. And so how do you address that? You help grow the pipeline, grow the pool by, rolling out programs. Some of the programs that we've rolled out, Chair's Mentoring Program is a signature program that's been running for about 15 years. If you look at ASX, and I appreciate we're focused on not-for-profits and charities, but just to borrow a stat from ASX space, you know, women on boards across ASX 200 used to sit at about 8.3%. That figure is close to 40% now. But when you dive deeper into that, what you realise with gender, if you just focus on gender, is that it's almost like ASX boards, you know, there was a point in which there were very few women. Now it's multiple women may hold multiple roles. And so it's about how do you grow the pipeline? How do you get boards to embrace diversity in all its forms? And because we are not one thing, gender absolutely, but broadening that out, cultural diversity is critical, as are the other diversity dimensions, First Nations representation, and a piece of research AICD did in partnership with Watermark and Deloitte is the Watermark Board Diversity Index, which looks at a host of diversity dimensions and tracks it, because what gets measured gets actioned, right? And so I think sponsorship programs, mentoring programs, and then actually making them really targeted at underrepresented communities and cohorts, and then providing them the support. And I speak from a place of lived experience of, you might have, you know, this idea of merit, right, which I could go on for hours, you'll have to shut me up, but like this idea of merit, many of us have it, but what we don't have is the access. What we don't have is the networks. What we don't have is the mates to call to, you know. So programs should be designed to help bridge that gap. So for people who don't have the access, the networks, how do you help create that for them? Because merit is not something that is exclusive to a particular demographic, and so it's about how do you help level the playing field.
So if I might be on a board or the chair of a board and looking to create those opportunities, is shadowing a good way that can help with that? Jess, I know that you've talked about that. What do you think there?
One of those things I could go on about all day. I put my teacher hat back on for a second. There's a concept in education that learning occurs, 10% occurs in the classroom, 20% occurs by confirming it with peers and working with others, learning from others, and the further 70% happens experientially on the job, confirming that. So there are great programs out there. The observership program is one that's been around for a really long time that takes that observing concept very seriously and does a good job of it. We do something similar at AIGI. It's only small, it's new, we're building it, but the idea is borrowing some of that idea from observing and not just linking it to the organisation, but linking it to the mentor, so that if you have access to an established Indigenous director, you don't just go to one of their board meetings a few times across the year. They take you to 2 or 3 different things and you get a real picture, and you get the difference then between what it is to be on a board as opposed to an advisory committee, as opposed to this thing I do over here. So that's a program we're running at AIGI. It's small, it's going really well. The challenge with that, though, of course, is building the mentor pipeline, because people are so busy. So we've got to try and, you know, focus on that. But I would also say that observing is a cultural thing, right? Like, I'm really lucky in that I grew up in a big, proud Aboriginal family in a small country town where my family are involved in everything. And I have an aunt who was the CEO of the Land Council for a long time, and when she calls me now as an adult and says, "Oh, let me talk you through something that's going on, I need a different perspective," that is observing, that's shadowing, that is the gift of intergenerational learning and transfer of knowledge and transfer of effective community governance principles, right? You don't know those words as a kid, but we live that. And when you see, you know, running the EDP, our Emerging Directors Program, launched a couple of weeks ago in Sydney, and one of the participants was talking about how she, as a child, attended a lot of meetings with her. Observing is very it's not a new concept. It works in contemporary settings as well.
At a really practical level, getting people involved on committees is a great way of letting them start out and see how things go. And in fact, I've seen it very effectively used in lots of different organisations. You've got someone that you think might be good for the board, they might not be there yet. Try them out in a committee, and you'll often find that, you know, within 12 to 18 months, they're kind of board ready. That's often, it can also be a really good way of getting access to skills you don't have. Particularly, you know, you might have certain qualification requirements under your constitution. Well, and you can't get access to a particular skill. It can be a great way of getting access to new skills and expertise. And having been a COSEC in the charitable sector, you're always trying to do more for less. So, you know, it can be often a great way of extending your limited resources.
It's a great answer, Catherine. And we've got some questions coming through on Slido, and it's a perfect segue. I'm going to edit this question a little bit, which is, how do you test for diversity of opinion? Because I think you've sort of touched on it a little bit. As a former COSEC myself, what I've experienced is you bring new people onto a board and you kind of go, oh, they look great on paper, they're a bit different, and then the board has to grapple with that, and that difference can be anything. I'd love to know from your perspective, how do boards test that? How do they grapple with that? And how do they maybe adapt to new people joining their group?
I'll start off on that one, and then I'll throw to Mariam and Jess. One of the most interesting examples I ever saw was that we had a fairly established board, and they wanted two younger guys, like that, I think they were in their 40s. And I was the COSEC, and I used to diligently prepare these board packs and copy them all and occupy the photocopier all afternoon. The two new guys in their 40s used laptops. It took one board meeting, everyone went online. So that was really a really simple example, but it's always stuck with me. You know, if you want to try get new things happening, just try bringing it or introducing it somewhere and see how the rest of your board adapts.
The point I was going to make is about, often we're looking for, you'll hear this terminology around cultural fit, and it's about challenging that to go to cultural add. So what can this person add, and why are we trying to get something to fit, right? So I get about the dynamic of the board and needing to ensure you bring someone in who's fits that, so to speak, but also I'd challenge that and go, well, how can this person add value? What is the perspective that they're bringing that might be challenging initially, but that really can actually help shift the thinking and the dynamic of the board? Unless it's, you know, a terrible situation, that's not what I'm talking about. But in general, to just change our thinking on that.
Add without World War III.
Sorry?
Add without creating World War
Correct,
III.
yeah.
The question was about how do we test groupthink? So it was,
No,
it was,
how do we test diversity of opinion?
Diversity of opinion, yeah. I was just trying to think of adding something to that. I think there's a conversation around being an effective chair, because I often find as a chair, and in boards, also I'm on a couple of RAP committees, a couple of different advisory things, and I chair a couple of them. And I'm always looking out for too much agreement to check if it's lazy. And so I think it sort of relates to the question. That's why I had groupthink in my head when I first heard the question. But as a chair, and if you are not a chair, does your chair go, okay, we all seem to be agreeing here. What are the different ideas? What's the worst case scenario? What could go wrong if we were to, how can you look out for too much agreement? Mm-hmm. I think is the flip side of that.
Yeah, I like that. I'm challenged a little bit by this idea that the chair is more important than the COSEC in that room, but I'll let you have that, Jess. We might finish on this question, but I think it's a really good one. What are examples of things not to do in this space? And Catherine, I might ask you first.
Well, I think Mariam's really talked about it very eloquently. I think, don't think about diversity as just being women. I think, don't be too narrow when thinking about diversity. I think that's the number one thing. Think about it broadly, and I think the point about what can this person add to the culture of the board and the skills of the board. So how can how can someone assist you in better delivering your mission? And I think that's very important. You know, what skills are they going to bring to help that's going to help us deliver mission better? That would be my take.
I think avoid tokenism, as I said, and ensure you're not setting up people for failure inadvertently by bringing them on because you want the diverse perspective, but not giving them the scaffolding, not giving them the governance education, for example, not perhaps providing a mentor to them to help support them on the journey, actually helps set them up for success. And then the cultural safety around that, training for the board if that is required to ensure that you're setting them up for success.
I would say that's so great, and even add to that by going back a few more steps. Of course, we're talking about board diversity, but is board representation even the answer for your context? So often organisations will come to us, and although it's not something we specifically offer advice on, but they will come to us and they will say, oh, we need help finding an Indigenous board member. And I've gotten really good at saying why. What is the business opportunity or challenge that you are trying to solve, and why have you arrived here? Is it a piece of consulting or advisory or education, or is it a team? Is it a role within the organisation instead? What are you trying to solve and why? And is this the answer? It might be the answer 6, 12, 18 months down the track. There might be steps to do first. Of course, I would love to see more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represented on boards, particularly in the not-for-profit sector and ASX as well. But I try to get people to be really critical about why, because that can be a real pitfall to getting into that space of tokenism if you've not thought about what am I trying to solve.
Thank you. And Catherine, Mariam and Jess, thank you so much for sharing your insight. That's been a great conversation, even if it's just a taster of a really big topic, but I appreciate it. So thank you for closing out our panel sessions for today in such a great way.